Welcome.
Thanks so much, Marion, and thanks everybody. I'll share my screen in a second, but just so you can actually see my face, because it might get small if I share my screen in the PowerPoint slides. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm a Californian and I live out in Los Angeles now, so you're going to hear a lot about LA. But I had spent about 7 years in Wisconsin, where I did my PhD at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and that's where Marion and I got to know each other. And so I have lots of ties. I did all my field research at Fort McCoy, which was in West Wisconsin, a Driftless area not too far from Minnesota. And so the ecosystems, the birds, the migration, all that stuff is super special for me. So it's been really nice to have Marion reach out and talk about some of the research. What I'm going to do today, and I'm just going to share my screen and get into this. I can't see. Hang on real quick. One more thing. Share the wrong screen. Where's my PowerPoint? Okay, there we go. So with the talk today, I'm going to talk a lot about urban ecology, and we're going to hear a bunch about Los Angeles, but I am going to try to bring it home to talk about Minnesota and Minneapolis in particular, and some of what we found here in Los Angeles that could be translatable to your city. And I changed the title a little bit, and I was telling Marion about this because I didn't want this to be just a one whole thing all about redlining, because there's a number of different things that we do in my lab. And a lot of it is thinking about how avifauna changes when you build a city and what happens to that avifauna. And then I want to end it talking about some contemporary drivers of urban avifauna, with the idea of thinking about how we can redesign our cities to be places that are total magnets for birds. And the point I'm going to make over and over in this talk, I might just say it once, but I'll say I'm going to do it over and over, is highlight how important our cities are for bird conservation, and they really are, and I hope that comes through today. I see a hand raised, but I can't see anyone, so I'll just let Marion do that if people have questions, but feel free to ask questions as we're moving along with this. All right, so just to set the stage, I just want to talk about the rapid ascent of Los Angeles from the late 1800s to today. So this is actually downtown LA in the 1890s. And this is the Los Angeles River moving from left to right. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the river that you see moving from left to right is the Los Angeles River. That's the famous river that's been channelized and has been in many movies. You can see the early formation of the city, the grids, and a lot of agriculture in this area. And the joke is that this area has changed massively, and so has that river over that time. And it's changed so much to this point that LA really is one of the most iconic cities on the planet. That's, of course, thanks to its entertainment industry, but really no other city in the United States has had as much change in the last 100 years as LA. And that's, I think I feel safe in saying that point. And what's interesting about that from my point of view, I'm a bird person. I used to be kind of known for running around Madison with my binoculars. I was a runner, but also would bird watch, and so I'd always be thinking about birds and their natural history throughout the year. And since moving to a city, what's really struck me is that you can have all these amazing bird experiences right here. And as I was saying, we got to get it right in our cities. We got to think about how we can develop and think forward in our cities in terms of birds, because birds are, I'm preaching to the choir and talking about this, but they are indicators of the health of the habitat. They are a connection with nature. They're all around us, and we can design our cities to be important for them. So with thinking about that, thinking about Los Angeles, thinking about what a great place this is, I want to jump into what I want to get into with today's presentation. So there's four things I'm going to talk about in this presentation. So number one will be historical drivers of thinking about redlining and thinking about some of our historic investment practices in cities and how that has carryover effects for still influencing the birds that we see in our cities. And I'll go over all of that in a couple slides. Two, I'm going to talk about historical change in avian communities. Basically, what happens when you build a massive city, kind of going back to the 1890s in that image to now, and how have things changed. Then I'm going to get into contemporary urban avifauna out here in Los Angeles and some things that we do in my research lab that's meant to really understand where birds are and where they're not, and what we can do with our cities for basically attracting birds and providing habitat for them. And then last, I'll talk about how about Minnesota, Minneapolis, and the Twin Cities, and what's going on out there, what's translatable or from the research in Los Angeles to your city. Okay, so moving on, I'm just going to jump right into redlining and getting into the entire thing. So what I want you to notice when you look at this image is a couple things. First, this is West LA, just to get you guys oriented with this. You can see Beverly Hills up in this green zone. Again, I don't know if my cursor is showing, but I'm just going to assume it is. Santa Monica and Venice are on the left side of your image, and then that's going off into the Pacific Ocean. And then there's just these polygon colors of red, yellow, green, and blue that you're going to see here. So what this is called a security risk map. And you might be wondering, what's a security risk map? And so I'm just going to get into the idea about what redlining was. So we've got to go all the way back to the Great Depression and what followed after for this practice. And we got to think about the New Deal, because much of this was coming out of the New Deal. So the decline in homeownership during the Great Depression, it was a major concern for political and financial leaders. We're this capitalist country. That's this idea about our strength, this idea of home ownership. And it was also this idea as a bulwark against radicalism for people to be owning these homes. And that was really what was going on at the time when we were thinking about our political leaders, our financial leaders, and what they were worried about. So they were freaked out when this was going on after the Great Depression. They figured, we got to fix this. So in 1933, the U.S. Federal Home Loan Bank and Board initiated a program named the Home Owners Loan Corporation. And just keep in mind, this is coming all the way through the federal government, all the things I'm going to talk about next. So you're going to see that phrase HOLC throughout the next maybe 15 slides or so. The HOLC was intended to assist homeowners in default, stabilize the mortgage lending system, and to identify prime areas for real estate investments. And that sounds great. It sounds like exactly what we need to do. But when you go back to one of these security risk maps, and they hand drew these things, the HLC over 239 cities across the country, what you would note is that there's a difference in what was going on with that investment in these areas. The green areas, or the green line areas, were areas that were said, these are very favorable for investment. That's where Beverly Hills was in this image, and some of these other very famous places in Los Angeles. The blue areas were also more or less seen as favorable for investment, whereas the yellow areas and the red areas, the yellow areas was less favorable. The red areas were downright hazardous for investment. And what was driving what was going on with the security risk maps was these were inherently racist. There was other classist things going on with these, but this was the time when we were thinking about this country with where we were at and where people were saying, okay, we need to invest in these communities. It's primarily white, primarily younger homes where they had jobs, had money, and they were doing what they needed to do. So I want to go back to this idea about this map right here. And the important point here is that many of these locations in LA and across these cities that were, quote, green line or blue line, they were already on the up. And so they were already there. And this just supercharged the investment in these places. The yellow and the red areas, they were already more or less, quote, like struggling. And thus it made it very difficult for people in those communities to do anything for home improvement, to get loans for relocation, whatever it might be. You might be wondering what a redlined area in LA currently looks like. So this is 90 years past the practice. And we might be able to focus on a location like here. This is Boyle. The top one is going to be Boyle Heights. And I'm just looking at a Google Earth image. This is in East LA. This is very close to my campus. The bottom one is going to be a section of Pasadena, which is only 5 miles or so as the crow flies from my campus. And if you notice these two images, you might see some differences in greenery. If you're on the ground, this is what it might look like in Boyle Heights versus what it might look like in Pasadena. It's very different, a very different process in LA than Minneapolis in terms of tree canopy. We're not a treed city. There's only a handful of places and sections of the cities, usually in the foothills of the mountains, where you're going to get trees or in riparian areas along a river. The rest of the place was more scrubland, shrubby, grasslands, wetlands, and marsh. And so to have trees like you see down here in Pasadena, you have to irrigate like crazy, and that costs a lot of money. So you see this very stark pattern between places where the investment hasn't been there historically, like Boyle Heights. No, there's way different tree canopy cover than a place like Pasadena where that investment's been there. This is obvious when you're in LA, and it's obvious in quite a lot of other cities that when you're just driving around, there's something going on here. There's something that's been going on for some time. So people have done research about this, and I'll highlight what these charts are. This is looking at cities from Los Angeles up in the upper left to Chicago to Cleveland, going across that first row all the way down to Philadelphia. And the colors are those A, B, C, and D zones in those security risk maps. Note the green line and the red lined areas by their colors. I know that's a difficult color combination, but that's just the way the security risk maps were drawn. And at least for LA, you can see a big difference. There's much higher tree canopy cover, which is on the vertical axis of these plots in in Los Angeles and those redlined areas. But it's a pattern that you see in New York City and Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, et cetera, Chicago. So we're seeing this in many, many cities across the country. We were really interested because of the obvious link. Most of you are probably birders, that you know that if you have nice habitat outside in your yard, whether it's your backyard or your front yard, it's going to be attracting wildlife. And so we wanted to know about that in Los Angeles. And then we were also interested in other types of urban habitat. So we set out to do a study for this. And what I'm going to show you is just, this is all greater Los Angeles. This is a large area that we're looking at. The ocean is down there off and to your left. And you notice these black dots that are all over the city. Since 2015, when I started my faculty position here at California State University, Los Angeles, we've gone out and we've counted birds primarily during the winter months. So I'll talk about why during the winter in a couple slides. And so we've had loads of data every single year where we go out and we just count and count and count birds. And we link those to certain various research questions in our lab. I had been talking about what's been going on with this idea about the distribution and wealth and income throughout LA and how it influences trees and potentially birds since 2015 with students in my lab. And we've done a number of studies with it, but we knew there was something much bigger and historical going on than what we were thinking of. In 2020, a famous project came out which mapped all of these security risk map locations. And so we can simply overlay them on our data to start linking patterns that we were seeing from our field data to these locations that were historically redlined, historically greenlined, et cetera. So that's setting the stage for what you're going to see in the next couple of slides. And I just want to talk about the two students that really started a lot of this project and were influential in the conversations, Sivan and Christian. They're great students in my lab. They've moved on to different things and are doing really well right now. I mentioned why we survey birds during the winter months. This is a Townsend's warbler on a eucalyptus tree, for those of you that are not familiar with some of these West Coast birds. And Los Angeles and coastal Southern California, when you get on the coastal slope of the mountains, it's famous, of course, for having very nice weather and very mild weather. It hardly freezes here during the winter. There's insects active all during the winter. There's tons and tons of different plants from around the world that people have put into this city. And so there's lots of food resources available for birds. And so during the winter months, millions of birds come down to spend the winter in the area before migrating back north during the summertime to breed in the Sierra Nevada, maybe up in British Columbia, maybe even as far as Alaska. So it's a little bit different than what we would notice in Minneapolis, where it's really amazing during migration, especially spring migration, and maybe potentially during the breeding season, but then fall migration is great too in the city. But the wintertime, you see comparably less birds. It's great in Los Angeles during the wintertime. So that's really why we do our studies there. And we really need to understand the ecology of these birds using the city during that time of the year. Okay, so I'm going to just zip past those because I just said that. So I just want to go over a couple slides about habitat and birds and what we see in Los Angeles when we're thinking about this idea with redlining and urban avifauna. So I just want to highlight a couple things here. So when I show these graphs, these are called box plots. And what you'll notice on the horizontal axis, it says A and B. These are locations where we survey, where we combine those high investment locations, the green lined and the blue lined areas. The C and the D are the low investment, historically low investment areas. Those would be the red lined areas. And those not graded areas were locations that just weren't part of the process, but we had data from. So we wanted to measure if these weren't part of the practice, how are they similar? This first one's looking at land value. So this is contemporary data that we're seeing based on this historical practice. Those A and B locations have way higher land value than those redlined locations and those not graded locations. The square footage of homes is much larger in those green lined and blue lined areas than those red lined areas, those C and D locations. The tree canopy cover, you get much greater trees in those A and B locations than those redlined locations. And then the impervious cover, which is just the amount of pavement, sidewalk, etc., is going to be much higher in those C and D locations. And so when you're looking at this and you're taking this all together, there's lower land values, there's smaller homes, there's less tree canopy, and there's more impervious surface cover in the redlined areas, and that's clear right now. So remember, this is something that happened 90 years ago in Los Angeles in terms of investment practices, and this is what we're still seeing today. How about birds? How does this look? If we focus on species that like trees and like shrubs, and I'm just going to call these forest birds like this Audubon's warbler or yellow-rumped warbler, and there's about 15 or so that we group for this data. Acorn woodpecker, some of these birds that some of you who've been to California may be familiar with. There's way more, unsurprisingly, in these locations where you have these larger lots, bigger backyards, bigger front yards, greater street tree canopy. You're going to find way more of those birds during the winter months than in some of the redlined areas. And then if you flip that around and you focus on these, quote, urban birds, like a house finch, a pigeon, a European starling, a northern mockingbird. There's about 12 that we have in this group. You see those are way more abundant in those red line zones than those high investment A and B locations. So redlined areas, lower migratory bird abundance, much higher of the urban bird abundance. And you might be asking, well, what's actually behind these patterns here? And I'm just going to show a few more graphs, and then I promise I'll ease off the statistics and everything for the rest of the talk and show cool pictures of birds or other maps. So if you want to say what describes the amount of forest bird abundance across LA, if you look at the land value, there's a very positive correlation between the two. And you can note the difference in the red and those blue and those orange colors. Those are our groups that we were looking at. And you see the opposite. So that means that there's more of those forest birds based on higher land value. And there's a historical context to that. For these urban birds, I'm looking at the graph on the right. It's the exact opposite, the inverse. There's way less of those urban birds based on when land value gets higher. Why? Probably because those forest birds are taking all that habitat up, and those urban birds say, I don't want to be here. I can just go downtown and hang out in one of the parks. And if I'm a pigeon, maybe eat some French fries. That's maybe what I'll do. Okay, when we're looking at tree canopy cover, that's another important one. And I just want to highlight that this is not as strong a relationship if you're, I stare at these types of graphs all day long, so I'm used to looking at these, but I'll just highlight that tree canopy cover, there's still a positive relationship with those forest birds, but land value is a stronger predictor. And it's the same thing when we're looking at the urban birds with that negative slope there. So the more tree canopy cover, the less of those urban birds. Okay, so again, strong correlations between these two. Now I want to just zip ahead. There's a ton of stuff in that paper. It's a big monograph. And the thing that a lot of people are interested in, and particularly a lot of my students, here's my lab right here, we're out bird watching, is are there relationships between human demographic patterns and birds in LA? And this is this. Okay, yeah, I'm sorry. I must have missed you just for 10 seconds. Maybe the internet just flipped out. Okay, so just moving ahead, I'm going to show you some maps of race and ethnicity in Los Angeles, just because we're going to link these to some of our bird patterns. There's a bunch going on in the background with statistics. And so I just want to highlight where we're seeing people in LA. And what you want to note when you're looking at this graph, these graphs, the next 5 slides, is LA is a very segregated city, depending on certain parts of the area. Why? There's a big historical context to this. And that's what we're talking about with some of the things that we're covering here. Okay, so what I want to focus on is this location in the middle of the graph. And I don't know. Marion, can you see my cursor?
Yes, I can see it. Okay. It's over the dark blue squares.
Okay, all right, that's good. I just want to make sure you guys can see what I'm talking about. I'm going to focus on this area. This is the South LA, and this is where the Black or African American population in LA is at its highest. And if you're wondering why, what some of the current reason for this, if you look at the historic and ongoing oil drilling locations in LA, there are these folds in the crust out here that we have, that these little undulations in the hill, these anticlines, and that's where the oil drilling was at its highest. Los Angeles is a city founded on oil. That's really where the modern day Los Angeles, that's really where it's from. It's not entertainment at all. But this string right here, going from down in Huntington Beach through Long Beach up through South LA, people that were working at the oil derricks often were Black or African American. These were the areas that were redlined back in the day, and then it was very difficult to get to move from these areas. When you look at the white population in Los Angeles, very much coastal, on the border with Orange County, very much in the foothills. These are massive mountains just north of these locations in the foothills. And then these are the Santa Monica Mountains, the famous Santa Monica Mountains with Malibu and et cetera being out a little further. The Asian population is going to be in the San Gabriel Valley, down in Palos Verdes Peninsula, on the border with Orange County, but you don't see that really in the center, like we were seeing in the Black or African American population. And then the Hispanic or Latino population in LA is heavily focused in South LA and East LA. And then getting into certain parts of the San Gabriel. I know like some of this, I'm just saying the names here just in case some of you are from LA and maybe this is kind of time travel for you. Okay, so again, with the Hispanic or Latino population, where are people living? These were a lot of areas that were historically redlined because of, again, going back to where a lot of the historic and ongoing oil drilling in LA was. This is some of the area I was just highlighting. Okay, so I just want to show you a couple images about who is currently living in these HOLC graded zones. So the green line, blue line, yellow line, red lined areas, and not graded areas. For the Black or African American population, you can't really see much of a pattern there. It's kind of the same. For the white population, definitely focused more in the green lined areas and then those blue lined areas and not so much in the yellow and red. The Asian population is kind of a similar pattern to the Black or African American population. And the Hispanic or Latino population is the exact opposite for what you're seeing with the white population, with a huge increase in those C and those D locations. So again, we were really curious about if you're living, and my university is predominantly 75% of the students there are Hispanic or Latino, first gen. And so they just know this. When you show them this graph, they're like, of course, I grew up in East LA, of course, this is just what it looks like. But particularly driven by the students, we wanted to put some numbers to this. Okay, so if you're gonna just ask that question, if you walk outside of your house, if you're in your front yard or your backyard or on your street corner, what birds are you going to experience if we go to that magical forest bird group, all those warblers that are here during the winter time? There's not much of a correlation there with Black or African American population. For the white population, there's a positive correlation as you go up, and note the distribution of all these red and yellow dots and then getting into those green and blue dots on the right-hand side where you're going to get a higher white percentage. You're going to get a higher forest bird abundance. For the Asian population, again, it's kind of like the Black or African American population. There's not much of a relationship there, but then we see that opposite negative relationship for the Hispanic or Latino population than for the white population. So the links that we make in this paper and that we do with some of this research is that there are these links between redlining, who's still living there, which birds are there, which habitat there, and who potentially gets to experience these birds. And this all has these cycles in public health, in experiencing nature, in activity levels. If you often live very far, LA is a very interesting city. For those of you that haven't been here, I don't know who planned this place, but you can be in the middle of the city and you could just be so far from any park. You could be so far from any kind of hiking trail or anything like that. It's very different from some of the cities in the Midwest. And often the people that are living as furthest away from all that stuff are Hispanic or Latino or Black or African American. Again, there's a historical signal to that in terms of which areas were redlined. So in summary, this definitely continues to affect avifauna and birds in LA. Don't worry about number 2. And then number 3, Hispanic or Latino communities experience lower diversity and abundance of urban avifauna. Okay, so people often ask us, are there solutions to this? Like, what can we do? The obvious answer is you could just toss money at the problem, right? That's something that we could talk about. What I want to do is highlight this image, or this graph, excuse me, of tree canopy cover versus these forest birds. And we're going to see this upward slope. And note that there's some dots that were redlined that are kind of on the high end of tree canopy cover and where those forest birds are. And I'm going to talk about 2. I'm going to talk about Venice Beach, of course, extremely famous place in this country. And then Pasadena, another famous place. You guys know the Rose Bowl, all that stuff. I live basically in Pasadena, and you're going to see some of this stuff, lots of trees up in that area. And so what's going on here? What are some of the solutions? Well, why was Venice, okay, I'll go to the next one. Why was Venice redlined? Venice was redlined because there was so much oil there. And if you go back to that oil map, you would eventually see it. Here's an image of people just going down for a Sunday dip in the ocean. next to your favorite oil derrick. And we've seen images of this in Huntington Beach and Manhattan Beach and some of these other famous locations in Southern California where someone thought it was a good idea to just do this. Of course, the oil derricks are gone. They're ripped down. And what do you have left in Venice? Some of the most expensive real estate in the entire country. And so that's is that a solution? Not really. It's just location. That's it. Here's Pasadena. This is Old Town Pasadena. The Rose Bowl is actually just right up here off this freeway. But freeway development has been an intense thing in LA, and it's a very studied thing in terms of where the freeways are. The freeways were often put right through red line and yellow line areas and very much avoided the green line and the blue lined areas. And why? Well, where's the political power? Where's the money, of course? Where's that going to happen? If you look at the distribution of freeways all over LA, it's crazy. I mean, they're all over the place. That's just how people get around here. There used to be a great rail network all over Southern California, but it's really just clogged freeways now. And often, again, these freeways were placed in areas that were, quote, red line. This is an image, a static image of air quality in South LA compared with some of the other locations in Los Angeles. And of course, when you're just surrounded by traffic and these cars all day long, you're going to have much higher concentrations of particulate matters and just some nasty stuff in the air. So what am I saying? Are there solutions to this? And the answer is not really, not that we've seen right here. So if I go back to this and look at this, and what I was going to say is tossing money at the problem. How does that work? If we were to go into some of these communities, and this has been done over and over again, and you toss money at saying, well, let's just put trees in. Everybody knows that's what we should do. Everybody thinks about that. Let's put parks in. Everybody knows that's a solution for some of this stuff. But right when you start doing that, what happens? The rents start to increase. The property values start to increase. The whole gentrification thing, you guys know about that. That's happened in Minnesota too, in Minneapolis too. And what's going on with that is people get displaced. And so is that a viable solution? We all want better communities. We all want to live in places where there's nice areas to recreate, be outside. Everybody wants that. But it's hard to do that in terms of just tossing money at the problem. So a lot of people know about this graph right here. They can look at it and be like, gosh, this is a real head scratcher. We've been thinking about this for 90 years and we still haven't figured it out. Our evidence suggests we're not going to figure it out in Los Angeles anytime soon, even though there's people really working really hard, a lot of smart people, a lot of great people to try to think about this. It's just a very difficult situation. Okay, so what I want to do, I'm going to zip past this. I want to get into, Marion, what time should I stop talking? And I'm sorry, we didn't to ask you a question.
We can go until 8 or 8:15. We have time.
Okay, cool. All right, so I want to switch gears a little bit. And I can come back to the redlining thing at the end, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. But I want to shift gears and talk about what happens when you just build this huge mega city on this area where there really wasn't anything in the late 1800s. What happens? And we wanted to find out. So I was recently a part of this big project about the historical ecology of LA. And our big job in my lab was to recreate the historical Avifauna of the area and then see how it's changed over time. We were linking this with historic indigenous villages. We had a bunch of indigenous colleagues in this project, and it was really a really cool thing to work on. And you might be wondering, well, how does something like this work? And so this is a grad student, Sean Lyon. He's now a PhD student at UC Merced. What is interesting about Los Angeles is that there were lots of people really interested in collections living here during the late 1800s and early 1900s. And by collections, I mean go out and get specimens of plants, go out and get specimens of birds, go out and find egg nests, and go out and do whatever you could to bring them in. That was a big business, of course, back at the time. And, so there's lots of amateur collectors out there. Los Angeles has this amazing data set of bird nests and eggs that are geolocated really amazingly all over the area. So you can go in and say there was a song sparrow breeding right here. There was a loggerhead shrike breeding over in this location. There was a yellow-billed cuckoo breeding down here on this river, whatever it might be. We also worked on trying to figure out what the historical land cover used to be like, whether it was grassland, whether it was forest and woodland, whether it was shrubland, whether it was dunes or flower fields. We did this, and just long story short, we were able to model using the historic land cover the distribution of over 100 birds all throughout LA. And then we could see how they changed over time. And so what do I mean by this? Let me get into this. I'm not going to talk, this is that land cover map of historically what LA used to look like. And these would be grassland areas. This is the San Fernando Valley. This is LAX. How many of you have flown in LAX? Wonderful airport. You might get stuck there. But LAX used to be the site of massive sand dunes and really amazing habitat that has just, of course, been completely flattened. When you go in from the coast a little bit, you start getting into what's called coastal sage scrub, a very beautiful and wonderful, delicate shrubland ecosystem, which has been just eviscerated because that's the lowlands where people build houses. A few rivers, you can see some of the riparian zones. Those are the forested habitats. But really, again, LA was not a treed habitat back in the day. So I'm just going to go through a couple before and after images of the distributions of birds. This is a historical distribution of a loggerhead shrike. And then I'll get to the contemporary distribution, and then I'll talk about why. And I'm just going to do this in pictures. And for those of you that are interested in some of the graphs, what I'm going to show in the next couple slides is the association for the occurrence, which this is 0 to 1, meaning it was actually in one of these designated cells or not. The bolded colors in these cells mean the bird was there. The bolder the colors, the less bold the colors are, this kind of beige colors, it means the bird was not there. And for a loggerhead shrike, they were predicted by the historical distribution of grassland and coastal sage scrub. That's what CSS means, proportion. So this is where they used to occur all over Los Angeles, these amazing birds. And now what has happened? Well, there's been about a 60% decrease in where these birds are occurring. You might wonder where we're getting the contemporary data from. This is from Breeding Bird Atlas data, which I imagine your Audubon chapter is probably affiliated with. And if anyone has any questions about Atlas data, I can describe that. I want to focus on this area right up here for what I'm going to show next. This is the San Fernando Valley, the valley. That's what people, from movies and stuff. All right, so this is what the San Fernando Valley used to look like. There's some homesteads out here and ranches. There's a huge ranching period going on, especially during Mexican occupation of this location. But grassland, that's what you would see out here. Now, what does it look like? Well, we put trees everywhere and we've irrigated water and we have houses all over. That's not going to do when we're thinking about habitat for a loggerhead shrike. So I realized on my slides I had shrike twice, so I'm going to go on and go to the next example. This is yellow-billed cuckoo, which, amazing birds. We love those here in California. We love them in Minnesota. But what's going on with the yellow-billed cuckoo population in the West is they're exclusively in gallery forest, big trees. A gallery forest is a riparian habitat along a river where you get these big trees. That's the only place you're going to find these birds. So where would their historic distribution be? Along the LA River, along the San Gabriel River, and along the Arroyo Seco. Those are kind of the big rivers that we would see throughout Los Angeles. And by big rivers, I mean these are dry rivers during the summer, but then they flow really intensely during the winter rains because there's just mountains everywhere out here. What about their current distribution? They're gone. That's it. Forget it. Totally extirpated from this area. Why? This is what the San Gabriel River used to look like. Awesome forest all along this river. Of course, you have these amazing mountains just coming down with all this water and habitat. And what great idea have we done to this area? We've channelized all the rivers out here. We've channelized all the rivers because you get tons of floods. When all that rain would hit those mountains, all that water would come down to the valleys. And there are too many devastating floods in the early portions of Los Angeles's history. So the Corps of Engineers and county and state groups work to channelize these rivers to get the water as quickly as you can out to the ocean and out of harm's way. What's so interesting about this is we have to irrigate water and transfer water from Northern California and the Colorado River to Los Angeles for all these trees, but then we try to get the local water out of here. I don't know. So people are working on that one, but that's a tough one. Okay, a few more that I want to highlight. So the grassland birds, the riparian birds, down. We've devastated those ecosystems. So, okay, I'm giving a talk, so close the door. Jenny. Sorry. Okay, so when looking at another bird, an Anna's hummingbird, maybe you've seen some of these birds if you've traveled out to the west, beautiful hummingbird. They are associated with our foothill and valley woodland areas. These are a mixture of oak and walnut that we get in some of the foothills here, awesome ecosystems. My university is in one of those ecosystems. We've just planted a couple thousand native oaks and walnuts across campus, which is quite exciting. But if you look at their historical distribution for the Anna's hummingbird, they're not all over the place, but now they're everywhere. Why, you might wonder? Well, here's the historic map of Burbank, California. You guys know Burbank for the entertainment industry. There's all sorts of studios that are located there. And this is what it looked like: dirt, grass, etc. So this is Olive Avenue then in the late 1800s. This is Olive Avenue now and in 2022. We've planted exotic plants everywhere. These are coast live oaks. The Anna's hummingbirds love those trees. So we planted trees that they can use for nesting, etc. So we completely transformed this area. We've created one of the most, we being Los Angeles, has created one of the most diverse urban forests in the country, if not the world, with that idea that you can just transfer water and then grow everything in this favorable climate. And birds like the Anna's hummingbird have totally capitalized on that. So hang on real quick. I'm sorry. Okay, I just need to make sure that my kids are not going to come in here into the room. Okay, so last one I want to talk about is a bird that is a beautiful bird. You may have seen if you've traveled again out to the west. This is the hooded oriole. And back in the historical time, the late 1800s, you'd only find this bird in this location, this little square location that may be up into Pasadena. Why? It's because people live there. These birds are famous for loving palm trees. And so if you look at their distribution now, they've exploded all over. I actually think they're in every single square in this map, but our data doesn't quite show that, but that's where I think they are. Okay, so this is Figueroa Street, a famous street in Los Angeles back in 1890s, and people would plant these palms all over the place, and these birds just love them. They'll nest in those like crazy. And so why now? Of course, LA looks like this all over the place. And so these birds are in these trees. You just be driving on the street and you can hear hooded orioles all the way at the tippy top of some of these Mexican fan palms and queen palms, and they'll just do just fine there. Okay, so if you're interested in just the statistics about this, all I wanted to tell you is that you see these two gray blobs. On the left is the historical bird community. On the right is how sites, this is a before and an after shift of the bird community. It's just completely radically shifted. Of course it has, because you built a big city and you took away all that habitat everywhere, but it's still interesting nonetheless to think about how things have changed. Okay, so I don't want to give you a bunch of text. I just want to keep talking about some things that are interesting. All right, so we've talked about redlining. We've talked about number 2, what happens when you build a big city. And now with number 3, I just want to highlight some research we have about what we can actually do to improve our cities. And I'm very much cherry picking an example from my lab that a lot of people in the Midwest think about, and that's this idea about native plant landscaping. So I'm just highlighting a paper called The Ecological Role of Native Plant Landscaping in Residential Yards to Birds During the Non-Breeding Period. And this was led by grad student Enrico Smallwood. And this is something that translates everywhere. So if we look at most houses throughout Los Angeles, they look just like this. Just some grass, maybe some hedges, some little palms. I don't even know what's there. But you would be hard-pressed to find anything that's native in most neighborhoods in this area. But of course, there's a big push at the city level to make this happen. And so there's incentive programs from Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, water savings ideas, et cetera, for people to convert their yards. I would say about 15 years ago, people out here were converting their yards to look like the desert. We do not live in the desert when we're on this side of the coastal slope. People were not converting their yards to California native plants, but you're starting to see that everywhere now as you go throughout the city, which is really great. Okay, so we were interested in how do birds feed differently on native versus non-native plants? And that's just simply watching them go and pick off berries or acorns or insects, caterpillars, whatever it might be. And so Noriko did this study where she stood in these yards that were dominated by native plants and then compared them with yards that didn't have any plants. And she would just simply watch birds feed. And of course, on the native plants, you see birds feeding much more, much higher feeding observations on those plants. I won't really name all the, well, oak, quercus species, and then there's some sage, toyon, manzanita. You might know some of these plants. So, okay, that makes sense. We know that birds are going to feed on there. Why? Because there's all these adaptations for the insect community on our native plants. The birds are going to sit there and feed on the insects. We're talking about food web dynamics now when we're thinking about this. And if we look at just simply plant cover, whether plants are native, the purple dots, or non-native, those orange dots, we notice a much higher feeding rates of these of birds in yards that have those native plants. So what should you do? Plant some native plants. Of course you should do that if you have the ability to do this. Of course, native to your area. Okay, I want to finish by just talking about, okay, so yeah, I was just talking about how birds like to feed on their native plants. And so we think that if you do things like, put some native trees down for the street tree canopy, that's going to have a big effect on birds in a city. But if you could start converting yards, which make up 60, 70% of the land cover in cities, you could have a massive effect on insect and bird populations within a city. Even if you could convert like 3% of those 70% of yards or whatever, you would have a massive impact on bringing in native wildlife into your cities. And when I say native wildlife, the thing that a lot of people in Los Angeles like to do and talk about is that they love their mountain lions, they love their bears, they love these things. Like, we're building overpasses on freeways, so like one mountain lion can cross it. And like, I don't want to diss that because that's important to be thinking about it, but we're bird people, and we know that if you want to improve habitat, you should improve it for things that can fly into the city. Because if we're trying to do that with corridors in a place like LA, it's really, really, really challenging. And I don't know. I don't know if I've got two little kids. I don't know if I want a mountain lion walking right down the street in our yard. Okay. All right. So last, I'm going to focus on this idea about, yeah, cool. So printing that stuff. So last, I just want to talk about the Twin Cities in Minnesota and just some of the things that I've discussed in this presentation today. All right. So this was my research done this morning. So I hope I get this right. And I just want to set the stage for, I really am not that familiar with Minneapolis or St. Paul. I haven't spent that much time there, even though I spent a lot of time living in the Midwest. So I apologize for that. If I get anything wrong, that's totally on me for this. So, of course, Minneapolis, like I said, 239 other cities went through this, had these security risk maps drawn on those. And you can see that the red lined and yellow lined areas, those were surrounding some of these industrial zones that were along the river. And then when you got further off into the suburbs, as you moved away from the river, that's where the blue line and the green line areas have gone. So Minneapolis, it has been shaped through redlining and also urban renewal. Urban renewal is that like kind of a fancy term, I think, for people to make themselves feel better, to like just demolish eminent domain, take over properties, take over places for freeways, like in Los Angeles, that happened big time, or it could be some other kind of capital project that might be needed to be done in the city. Okay, so looking at this and redlining in the Twin Cities, shady practices, a new mapping tool shows inequity of tree cover in the metro. It's not just LA where we see these things. I kind of highlighted that in the previous image, but I just want to show you this. And so this is just a tree canopy of Minneapolis. The river is going to go right in this area. Here's the Big Bend right there. If you remember what I was showing earlier, a lot of red-lined and yellow-lined areas were right along this zone. I know it's industrial. I know there's downtown. I know there's a bunch of that stuff going on too. But you definitely see a much bigger difference in terms of tree canopy cover when you get into kind of the downtown portion. I think it's downtown. I hope I'm not getting that wrong. Area of Minneapolis. So of course, if you change the tree canopy cover, that's going to have obvious impacts on the bird community, just like we were seeing in Los Angeles. You're going to get a lot more of those urban birds in these places, whatever, pigeons, all that stuff. And then you're going to get a lot more of those cool migrating wood warblers during the spring out in these locations. Doesn't mean you can't find them here. And that's what a lot of us birders love to do, right? We love to go out and just hunt and find stuff in certain areas. It's just going to be much harder to do it in those locations. Okay, so what if we correlate this with temperature? When we're looking at this image right here, temperature, it's totally correlated with tree cover and of course impervious cover. All these things have these feedback loops into like this, like increasing temperature. So why could this matter? Well, birds, like any organism, have their physiological tolerances. And so this could also be another driver about, hey, it's too hot there. I don't want to hang out in that location. I'm going to cook during the summertime. I'm going to go hang out in those leafy suburbs. That's another kind of correlate that can be influencing where you're going to find certain birds. So on that second bullet point, in a city with trees like Minneapolis and St. Paul, planting and maintaining is really key. But what about our arid cities? What about Phoenix and Las Vegas and LA? Again, those are not treed cities. And so it's really expensive to irrigate, to get those to communities where you have to really work to maintain trees in those locations. So I kind of feel like there's more opportunities to get this right in a place like Minneapolis and LA, but I don't know. I could be totally wrong on that. So anyway, I can speak a lot more about that if anyone had any questions about it. The last thing I want to do with this presentation is I got interested in this idea about native plants and conversions of yards in Madison when I lived out there. It was a long time ago when I was thinking about this. I felt like Madison, once I moved to LA, was 25 years ahead of Los Angeles and people in LA with thinking about this, thinking that you can create these awesome little prairies in your front yard or whatever it might be to attract things like monarchs or other types of native solitary bees or certain birds that you might, be interested in attracting to your yard. And so again, when I moved to California, I was really surprised. I just thought, what the heck? This is such a kind of a, I don't want to make it sound like we're not thinking here, those of us that are thinking about this stuff, but it's a very obvious thing to think about doing if we're thinking about improving habitat for butterflies and bees and birds and all that. So again, kudos to the Midwest. You guys are doing this in abundance, but keep doing it because, of course, we know that's going to have major impacts and effects on the types of animals that we want to attract in our cities and that we need to also not necessarily attract to our cities, but we need to provide habitat for throughout the annual cycle. So with that, I'm just getting towards 8 o'clock, so I think I'm going to wrap that up. I just want to say thank you for being a part of this presentation. I hope you learned something about cities, and I'll just make that plug one more time that really thinking about the history of ecology has its roots in going off to faraway places and thinking about ecological theory and protected areas and national parks and different countries that had rainforest or whatever it is. We are doing that now. Lots of people are doing that now in our cities, and Minneapolis actually has probably bigger chance. I feel like LA is the place to be for this type of study. But Minneapolis, what's really exciting, and I don't know if you're all aware of this, but I hope so, there's a brand new project in the Twin Cities, and it's called a long-term ecological research project on urban systems. And there's going to be a lot of urban ecology. This was a very hyper-competitive award that went to Minneapolis. We applied for it in LA and didn't get it. Kind of bummed about that, but also very happy it went to a city in the Midwest because you guys have the chance to really be shaping about how people think about cities as we move forward in the future. And we have to do that. We have to get that right when we're thinking about our birds and biodiversity. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wood. That was an amazing presentation. If anyone has any questions, please type them in the Q&A box below the video image on your Zoom screen. I have a quick follow-up question. You mentioned that increasing tree canopy in Los Angeles is a driver of gentrification. And
Yes.
I'm wondering if you would say that's true in a treed city like Minneapolis, and if native plants are like a native garden in a residential area is also a driver of gentrification, or to lesser extent.
I think it's a really interesting question. So the first thought that came to my mind was I have colleagues in Raleigh, North Carolina, and what they see who study kind of the same thing, and what they see, and this might be a very different idea than what's going on in Minneapolis, but what they see is that in redlined areas where there's kind of decrepit buildings or something like that, there's actually a lot of vegetation, a lot of feral growth, and I know that's happened in Detroit and locations where there's been some land abandonment in some of the cities. And so I don't know if it's just necessarily trees per se, but if there's larger projects like bike lanes, that have trees and native plants all along those in locations that maybe we're kind of struggling, or if there's larger urban parks and trail systems, I think those types of things, that we see that here in Los Angeles, and I think those types of things lead to that. Again, it's a very hard thing because we all want that stuff. We all think that's important. We all think it's a major public health win to start doing things like that. And so it's a very delicate balance about like how much investment should we do for these things versus getting to that point like this is pretty hard. What we say out here is that as long as a community is there at the table, and especially in these like really ethnically diverse cities like Los Angeles and Minneapolis and St. Paul, that people have a say in how they get their communities and their neighborhoods developed so they can enjoy it and be a part of it.
So someone asks, how can we follow the work of the big study you mentioned? I think that's the LTER.
Yeah,
And I believe that's on the U of M. If you just Google long-term ecological uh, something something.
I don't know. Yeah, and maybe your chapter, you guys could get a couple resources about that, but it's new. I don't know if it's been in existence for 2 years or 1 year, but it's new. And so they probably should have a website for what they're going to start doing. I imagine it's going to take a few years for them to really build the structure that they want and the research and the outreach. I'm sure they're going to have lots of cool things going on that are going to be based at the U of M. And then maybe they're going to have a building somewhere else at a nature center. Who really knows? But that would be a great thing for your Audubon chapter to kind of sort of be a part of in some way. I don't know how, but that could be really cool.
That would be cool. And then someone's asking about glass affecting avian populations in cities too. I can speak to that. Glass is one of the top 3 or 4 causes of bird mortality in the US. Minneapolis is one of the worst cities. Um, and then I know that our chapter does a lot of advocacy around bird safety in the built environment. We have a global bird rescue event um, every fall, and we're expanding to spring. And so then I'll just um, let Dr. Wood speak more globally on your research in LA if you'd like.
Yeah, exactly what Marion was saying is window strikes for birds, especially in Chicago, especially in the Twin Cities, especially at the football stadium, like this is a big, well-known issue and problem. And so there's the lights out campaigns to not attract birds to, especially at night, if we're migrating at night. Many of our songbirds are going to migrate at night. They get disoriented with the lights, they might smack into the buildings. When you have those weather events, especially Chicago's famous for this, where there might be some low-lying fog along the lake, and then you have all those big buildings right on the lakes. You probably saw this. I think it was last fall. Just devastating mortality of birds that are migrating in those locations. So it's a big problem. Here's downtown LA, which it's kind of a weird. I mean, LA is just sprawl. When you fly into LA, you're flying for like 45 minutes over sprawl before you get to the airport. But we definitely have window strikes and we definitely have things that happen at the scale of like these big buildings, but just throughout the city. Hummingbirds all the time will chase each other and fly into buildings and that's that. So it's a big problem, even in a city like LA, where it's a little bit more diffuse in terms of where the buildings are, where the birds are going to migrate. And so it's a huge problem. Do your best. Follow. There's some really interesting guidelines that I think National Audubon puts out, and Marion I think was alluding to some of that about what you can do to your windows. You could put little decals on. You could do things that can help just within in your yard, and then you could just get active and talking about those lights off campaigns because all that stuff is going to be really important. It's a big problem.
Yes, and Minneapolis is also famous for its skyways.
Mhm.
If you
Oh,
guys
yeah.
have been downtown, we have those clear glass walkways, which is nice, so you don't have to go outside in the winter. But they are um, invisible to most birds. So if you want to get involved in advocacy or citizen science projects around um, glass and bird mortality, feel free to visit our website and we have a citizen science page. Um, I wanted to go, let's see if we have another question in the Q&A. Carolyn posted the LTER link and it looks like I accidentally moved it into the answered tab. And then I wanted to just ask Dr. Wood, when you talk to policymakers or any sort of like housing advocacy people about this issue, how do you frame the issue? Like, do policymakers care about Hispanic and Latinos access to like a rich uh, avian experience or ecological experience in their neighborhoods, or do you try to frame it in terms of public health and equity?
Yeah, not the first part. They don't care. Nobody really cares about that. We can make that link all we want, us that, enjoy birds and know that it enriches our lives. But for most people, that's just, it doesn't track. And so it's broader public health things. It's talking about how if we increase tree canopy cover and have parks in these areas, this is going to help with rates of diabetes or whatever it might be. And so that's really where the conversation goes. I've read all of those papers so I can have those conversations, because what I found is that when I'm just talking about birds, if it's not for an audience like this, it just doesn't gain as much traction. What I will say though is that what's happening in Los Angeles, and I bet you it's either already happened in Minneapolis or it will happen soon, but we have a very kind of progressive idea with making our city better for biodiversity. We have it's like written into the city's documents about how to do this. LA Sanitation is a group that's really kind of seems like a funny group to be leading that, but that they have an entire biodiversity group. I'm a part of their panel in terms of talking about these types of things, and they care, and they talk to the mayor's office, and they talk to the people that do the planning and zoning. And so I think it's just making sure that those groups are there to listen to some of the issues that we're discussing, and making sure that it really is a public health problem and crisis to have certain sections of our population not be able to experience nature. We know that because everybody wants that, but not having to drive an hour just to see that it's too much for a lot of people. Either you're muted or I think you're muted. Okay.
I'll just keep asking questions. We have a little bit of time, but if other people have questions, feel free to type them. When you first moved to LA from the Midwest, it sounds like there was maybe a little culture shock and ecological shock. Was your initial research into the history of redlining, was that part of your initial research project, or did you come across it by way of trying to learn about the new city you just moved to?
Yeah, so I'm from California, and so nothing was a shock for me. And I was like, actually, I was living in Ithaca, and I was working at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology before moving out here. And so when I moved here, what was a shock for me was I just was so surprised at how in your face it was when you're just driving from one section of the town to the next, and that idea about where all the trees are. And this first paper, I just linked it right here in the chat, was the first thing that we did with just trying to understand the distribution of street trees and how that influences birds in the city. Because it was just so obvious that there was something there, and it was so obvious that it was completely linked to wealth and for something about it. So that was like that paper is the first paper that we published here. And that was really the driver for a lot of these other studies that we've done about this. And so yeah, that I could like kind of talk about that for some time, but it was really something that we didn't really know historically. I just wasn't even familiar with redlining. I'd heard about it here and there, but I didn't even really understand it until probably 2019, 2020. And that's where we thought we got to look at this more historically rather than just these current patterns of income throughout the city.
Yeah, I moved to Minneapolis in 2018, and I really didn't know anything about the redlining history of the city until recently. That we have a big um, DOT study on rethinking the I-94, and it was only through that news coverage that I was able to learn that this historically Black neighborhood had been eminent domain into building this section of I-94. And then our local paper ran a story about land covenants and
Yep.
provided a tool where you could look up your own residence and see if there's a land covenant attached to your property covenant attached to your property, and then undo it. And so I was wondering, like, for people who are transplants here or just don't know their redlining history, is a historical society like a good public resource for people to try to um, gain a better local understanding, or how would you get started as a layperson?
Those images I showed right at the end about like the tree cover and that was like I think a tool that the Nature Conservancy put together. I can link it.
Oh, okay,
Um,
that would be great.
'Cause it was a called an ArcGIS story map, and that would be a good thing for people to just kind of go through. It's written in a way that's very understandable, and hopefully you can just kind of follow along with it. Let me find it really quick. I can't talk and this at the same time, but this might be a useful thing to just look at, just to understand some of this history. And I think that's the important point, is that we all got to just sit here and just look and be like, well, this is just the history of this country, and so we got to think about it, we got to understand it, we got to know about it, and then that's going to help us with thinking about as we're going forward with everything with these our cities, and thinking about our cities are so dynamic, they're changing all the time. But again, we have to know that historical context for really to for us to understand what we want to do in terms of future development, etc.
So we have a question in the chat, and then it looks like Anthony Pasco raised their hand. If Anthony, if you could just type your question into the Q&A box. It's on the bottom part of your Zoom screen. There's like a menu bar. And then Michael asks if there's any foreign cities that we could learn from that maybe haven't been redlined.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. So I'm applying for sabbatical now to go to Australia to do some research and do basically this. And because there are some, thinking about Aboriginal culture in Australia, and thinking about zoning practices and investment practices, same kind of thing, different sort of names. There was redlining that went on in some Canadian cities as well. And so there was some of this that was happening. If you're trying to think about a good example cities where I don't know, like from this zoning practice, but in terms of urban greening, a lot of people look towards Singapore. That's one of the cities that a lot of people try to get inspiration from. It's kind of a hard case study, because it's such a kind of wealthy and dense city, and they have the money to kind of be thinking about some of these things. But that's really where LA, that's what we look towards. There was a thing called the Singapore Index, which was done, oh, I don't know, like 6 years ago or so. And it was to basically do what's called a gap analysis. And so what people do there is find out all the areas where the city's doing really well in terms of urban greening and biodiversity, and the places where there's gaps and where they need to improve it. And so that's what the Singapore Index was all about. And it was really wild how many things they were thinking about, to like the finest detail. And so we did that in LA, and we've got a lot of gaps here. So I don't know if that is the best way to do it. But in terms of like the zoning practices, I don't think there is a good example, because you know, most colonial countries have some kind of stuff going on was pretty bad in terms of history and who was getting what. And some of that, like we can just broadly think about that as kind of obvious, but and there's probably a story like this redlining in many countries throughout the world.
Right. So we have time for a couple more questions. Anthony asks if any urban planners are studying this because they plan cities.
Of course they are, and they all know about this stuff, and they all think about this stuff. There's millions of urban planners that think about these things, and they don't think about the bird aspect of it, but they definitely think about the public health aspect of it. That's the big thing that catches an urban planner's attention. And so they, when you look at going past this stuff, this practice was halted formally in the 1960s. And so there's been so many investment projects and so many things that have been done in LA by urban planners to try to get out of this. But what our data are showing is that we're nowhere near that, with thinking of some of the basic metrics that you want to look at in terms of environmental quality, tree canopy cover, birds, where those are going to be. Maybe some of the public health metrics have improved, and that would be a plus for sure. But we haven't been able to plan our way out of this, and there's a lot of people that think about this stuff.
So another question here in Minneapolis, I've noticed trees planted where there is no open land, just concrete. can trees actually flourish in these situations
Wait, to say that again. So they're planted in open land?
where there is no open land, just concrete? So I think maybe like a
Right.
street tree type thing or just like along a sidewalk.
Yeah, it just depends on the tree well. So that's the cut in the sidewalk that you're going to put that street tree down. There's some trees that do okay when their roots are underneath that. You're going to get much wetter soil and different conditions under the concrete than if it was just open. And so in LA, what we see a lot of for the street trees are trees that are from the southeast. These are swamp trees that are used to being in wet soils, and they grow pretty well as street trees. A lot of there's only like a handful of native trees in Southern California that you would plant along a street, and they do not do well. You have to have a much bigger cut. And so what you see in a lot of locations, especially like in Pasadena, you'll have your lawn and then you'll have your sidewalk, but then it's just grass right there. It's not necessarily concrete, and you can see some like big trees that grow in those situations. But then they rip up the sidewalk, and there's all sorts of like other kind of maintenance things and that people worry about. So, and then to answer the question, there are certain trees that do just fine, and you will have some native trees in Minnesota that they can do. And I don't know which ones those are, but I'm sure the urban forestry department would know. But you have to like, okay, so here's a rule, and this kind of goes back to some of our early street tree work. There's this thing that was proposed in cities that cities need to be. It's called the 10-20-30 rule. And what that states is that no more than 10% of a city's tree canopy can be a certain species, no more than 20% can be a certain family, and no more than 30% can be a certain genus. So um, like an oak tree or something like that. And the reason is because we used to plant our trees with nothing but elm or nothing but, and then Dutch elm disease came in and wiped it out. You guys are familiar with emerald ash borer beetle, and that's wiping out a lot of our ash trees because we would just plant nothing but ash along our streets. And so the idea of having a diversity of trees is to have a resilient urban tree canopy cover. So if you're doing those things, going back to that question about figuring out which native trees would grow well in those street wells, advocate for that for sure. But know that the city is going to be thinking about the diversity thing as well. They're not just going to plant the same old, red oak up and down the street or whatever it is, because they just are terrified of that.
That actually leads into my question, which can be the last question. So Minneapolis has a street tree program. Um, they prioritize by zip code, like historically less canopy, and they offer a lot of natives as well as fruit trees. And one question I always have when I live near Lake Nokomis, is I see like a weeping willow by a blue spruce tree and a maple and then like some kind of oak. And I was wondering, thinking back to the hooded oriole and the Anna's hummingbird,
Yeah.
and then the cuckoo and the shrike that like seemed like they needed a more specific environment. Does like continuity in your canopy like of like what would like coexist in an ecosystem, does that matter, or is it just asking the city to like reach too high to be like, in addition to like the 20-10-20-30 rule and considering natives, I also want you to like think about an ecological landscape? Is that too much to ask, or is it, how important is that?
I think it's hugely important. I don't think it's too much to ask for us, but I think once you start getting to the level, I think that thought is a thought that a lot of us have in our community, and it still hasn't gotten to that point at like where your basic landscaper knows exactly how to put a coastal sage scrub ecosystem in the front yard. And so a lot of like the native plant stuff we do is, you're right, it's like a hodgepodge of things that would never grow naturally together. And that's kind of weird ecologically. And so if you could do it where you were really going to plant a prairie and you were going to do it almost in like a restoration type way where you're going to have the right mixes of grasses and forbs, that would be the way to go. I just don't know, like maybe Minneapolis is doing this because again, you guys are 25 years ahead of where Los Angeles is at with thinking about some of these things. And so maybe that idea would track with certain people that are trying to do that on the margins of a park or an area that is like quote zoned or planned to have some native plants there, because that's really what you want. You don't just want like your boreal tree mixed with, your oak savanna type thing. That'd be weird.
Uh, Um, well, I'd like to thank you again for a wonderful presentation. For those of you who missed part of this, we'll put it on our YouTube channel and share it through our email distribution. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. And I'm so thankful to you, Dr. Wood, for sharing your exciting research and hoping that more people will follow you and stay in touch with the interesting new horizons you're exploring.
I will. On that note, can I promote one thing?
Sure.
So we are starting our Urban Ecology Center, and that's a brand new thing that it's at my university, but it's meant to be a much bigger thing throughout the city. And there's the Urban Ecology Center in Milwaukee, and so we're trying not to be them and trying to do different things. And so we actually have to probably rename a little bit, and because we don't want to have the same name. I didn't name it, but I'm the co-director of it right now, and we have lots of big plans for what we're going to do with it. And it's meant our pillars are research, teaching, and education. Demonstration, which is pillars for a lot of like Audubon groups, but also like natural history groups. But we have big aspirations, and so maybe there's some things that we're going to be doing that might make news. And please look for us, and please visit us if you're in Los Angeles, because yeah, and we're all focused on like underserved communities and all this stuff that we're talking about here in this presentation that I was talking about. That's a big focus for what we want to do.
Oh, that sounds amazing. And good luck. When is that set to open?
It's open. We're
Oh, it's
good.
open. Okay.
Yeah, we're a thing. We like officially started in the fall. We have a very modest budget right now, so we're doing our fundraising. We're trying to build a building. We're trying to do a lot of this stuff. So it's really like from the ground up right now, but it's exciting to be a part of it. There's a ton of energy in this. When we go to promote this to people, people get really excited about it. But when you promote like, let's do a native plant garden that is going to bring in birds, people are like, the thing that gets most people interested in the urban ecology stuff that I've seen so far is that issue of food security, because we all care about food. And you can make obvious links with designing our community gardens and our urban farms in a way that attract wildlife, and you can put native plants in them, you can do all that stuff. And so that's the one that really gets a lot of people's attention, and that's another public health thing. And so that's a big part of what we're doing too, is just promoting that in terms of demonstration that we can think about for food security research, etc. But follow us. I don't even know if we have a Twitter yet. We're supposed to, but we'll see.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
Feel free to share those on email and I'll send them out to our uh, list of registered, the people who signed up to attend tonight.
cool. Thanks, Marion. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much and good luck with your continuing your research in the center.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone, for joining. Thanks, Marion, for having me, and I wish you all best of luck too. And I'll visit next time I'm in Minneapolis.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. All right,
Okay.
take care.
All right. So long. Bye. Bye, everybody.